Good morning and welcome to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Today we're going to be working on our Azure project. And as you recall, this is a project with really small blocks, and the blocks are coming out of a book called The Bible Sampler Quilt. And the author of this book is Lori Erin Hurd, H-I-R-D. And we're using these blocks, we're not using all of them, we're just using a collection of them to make a small project that we can hang on the wall. And that's where we're going to start. Now, as you noticed, let me pick this up again. The quilt that's pictured on the front of the book is the quilt that's being built in this book. And they're all very muted colors. There's some brights in there, but generally it's pretty muted. And that typically isn't my style. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be doing this in random shades of blue. And I have 5 main blue fabrics that I'm going to be using, and then use a white as a background. So before we get started on this, I want to tell you a little bit about my experience so far and how we're going to proceed with this. And we'll be right back and do that. So hi, now this project has been a bit of a challenge for me. I'm just going to be really upfront about that, because I flipped through the book and I really liked the blocks that I saw, and I thought that we could pick somewhere between 16 and 25 and make a small wall hanging that we could put up here. And blue is my favorite color, and that's why I chose blue. And I have some fabrics that I really truly love. And it gives us a little bit of a growing mechanism that if we need to add in a different fabric because we run out or we want to enhance the quilt or the project in some way, we can do that as well by adding another fabric. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how my experience with this project has transitioned thus far. Originally, I was going to do traditional piecing, just machine stitching, cutting them out, machine stitching them together, and coming up with the blocks, because I thought this was really straightforward. The problem is, when I started doing that, I picked a block to start with that I thought was moderately difficult. It had some Y seams, it had some points, but it didn't have a whole lot of fabrics, and I thought it would be relatively easy to do and would really give me a good idea of how difficult this was going to be. So I made that first block, and the one I chose to start with was Job's Trouble. Now in the book, this is number 54. And the book is great about giving you the pattern pieces and some of the instructions that go with it. So what I did was I took the pattern from the book. Here it is. It comes on 2 pieces of paper. And I cut out the pieces and I constructed them all together, sewed them the way it shows to put it together. And this is the block that I got. It looks really cute from a distance. But as you get really close up, what you begin to notice is it doesn't have very good Y seams. There's a little buckle here in the center where from a distance you don't notice it, but up close you can tell that it wasn't sewn together properly. And most importantly, 2 issues. Number 1, the way these points come out at the end in the corners. Let's make sure you can see that. Yeah. They don't come together well. The ends are wavy, and most importantly, it's not the right size. It is a good, I would say somewhere between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch too small overall. So when you try to start joining up these blocks, that's going to be a problem. So I thought about what were my options, because obviously the traditional way of putting this together was not going to work for me. So I thought, well, maybe I could do it as an EPP, because I was flipping through the blocks and some of them truly could be done as EPP. But then I go back to this block and I'm thinking about those points. Yeah, sure, I could cut the pattern for an EPP. Sure, I could join them together. But how on earth was I going to fold over an EPP piece with points that sharp? I just didn't see how it could be done. So then the only other alternative was to do it as a foundation paper piecing. And fortunately, she does give you the templates and instructions in the book for that. And as a matter of fact, that's the instructions we're looking at. The ones for the traditional paper piecing are not printed out here. And she also gives you some instructions about how to do foundation paper piecing, which for somebody like me, that was really helpful because I've never done this before. And I was a little concerned about it, but I said, if we're going to do this, we have to figure out a way to do it, because the way I was thinking we were going to do it just isn't working. So I sat down with the same block, the one I had the disastrous results with, and tried it again as foundation paper piecing. Now, I recorded all of that, and I had a bunch of footage, but when I tried to put it all together, there was so much footage of me trying to figure out how to do it, and with all the cuts and trying to edit it together and speed things up. It's just not something that I think you would enjoy, and it wasn't pleasurable for me to go in and edit it and come up with anything. So I have this one finished, and what we'll do is we'll go back later and do Job's Trouble, but today we're going to move on to another one. But the end result of Job's Trouble was a block that I can be proud of. And I think that we can move forward on the foundation paper piecing and come up with some really nice work. Now, with this, all of my points came together in the middle. All of my points came together on the outside, and I figured out what was wrong to get it the right size. So I'm very happy with this, and like I said, we'll come back and do this block later. Now, let's talk a little bit about the block we're going to do today and a couple of important points that you need to know if you're going to do this. Let's start with the important points first, because you'll need that for every one. On her instructions in this book, she gives you a little block at the end of the page that you can measure to make sure that your block is the size it should be. And what I found is her instructions say to print at 100%. I found when I printed on my computer that really if I printed at 101%, I got a better match. And it's possible I could even go to a 102. So check it very carefully, and check it every time you do a block to make sure you're in line with the size you need. So this one I am right at 1 inch. Now, the block we're doing today is Garden of Eden, and I want to show you that if I can find it real quick. Here it is. So there's the block. Here's the block from her quilt, and the little piece here which shows you how it's constructed and the pieces that you need. Okay, just a quick look at that. When I looked really quickly at the history for the Garden of Eden block, what I found was that there were variations of the block as early as the mid-1850s. And there were a lot of variations in this block. Some have a square and a square instead of the solid squares like we'll be using. It was also known as the economy block because it allowed people to use smaller pieces of fabric to make a block. And it was published this way. It looks like 1900 to 1915 based on some of the information I have. And there is a quilt called the Amish Garden of Eden quilt in the National Quilt Collection. I'm checking my notes just to be sure, at the American Museum of American History. And that quilt was designed or stitched in Pennsylvania. And that they think is that 1900 to 1915 timeline. So it is a very old block, as many of them are. And it's a pretty simple block, but it's the one we're going to do today. Now you can see here from this little image of the block itself, what I do is I sit down and look at those 5 fabrics we have and decide which fabric is going where. And you can see that on my drawing here where I've kind of colored in things just to get it in my mind what we're using. On a block like this, it's not too difficult to keep track of that. But as we get into some of the blocks that have multiple fabrics, multiple colors, we're going to need something to reference back to. So this is the instructions on that. And let's just see. I think that's all for this. And now we need to get into the pieces. Now for this one, we have 4 corners, and then we have a big X or cross in the middle that are larger. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to put together 2 pieces like this, 2 pieces like this, and then one of these. Now, as you can see, this is the piece of paper that's been printed on. And the tricky part to this for me is that you have that printed image up when you are sewing it, but when you're constructing it, you're working on the back side of that. And it requires, at least for me, the ability to almost think backwards. So you have to think about how you want it to be, how that fabric needs to be turned over and flipped the other way. So it gets a little confusing, at least for me. But what I've found is the longer I sit and work on something, the more natural that reverse thinking becomes, and I can move through it a little quickly. So I've found that in sitting down and being able to do the repetitive pieces of a block at the same time have been very helpful. So already on this one, I have these 2 done. I have one of these done, and I have this one. This is just a plain block. That one is ready to go. So we need to work on the 4th one, and it will be one just like this. Now you can see that I have placed the fabric on the back side with the right side up. So we can see the right side of the fabric on the back of the paper piece. And you can either pin this in place, or I've found sometimes when I've got a block that the first stitching is going to be something where this one needs to stay in place. I prefer to just put a little stitch there to hold it in place. And you can see even on this one, or some of the other ones, it took a couple of tries to get it just right. And also one of the other things I've found is that you're going to need a bigger piece of fabric than what you think you are, because you see this little tiny block, for example, this little Okay, we've got those lined up. I'm going to put an extra pin just to keep these from spinning on me. Because if they spin, they won't make it wide enough to be where it needs to. Now, common sense is you would sew here where you see these fabrics, but we're going to turn it over and sew on the printed side. And we're sewing right on that printed line, and we're starting in the seam allowance. And we're going to have a stitch, I would say 2.6, 2.8, something in that range for our seams that are going to stay. So we're going to start in the seam allowance and stitch right on that line. And then stop. I don't backspace these. Now, the other thing I should have mentioned is making sure that your fabrics are right sides together. Because I've redone many of those, and when I'm looking at this one right now, this one's wrong too. One of them is in place properly and the other one is not. So let's change that before we have to rip it out again. Can you tell that's been a common problem? Well, it has. Okay, so we're going to try this again. And we're going to stitch right on that line. And let's see how we did. Less likely to run over the head of a pin. Okay, let's try sewing those and see what we get. Again, we're going to start in the seam allowance. Now, let me just say, before we get any further into this, I am not an expert at foundation paper piecing. This is the first project I've ever done with this. So if you have any hints or tips from me, I would love to hear them, especially before we get too far into this project. So let's do this now. Let's pin these two pieces into place. Again, keeping those heads of the And we're just going to go ahead and sew it and see what happens. You could pin that if you wanted to. I think I'm going to try to wing it without it and see what happens. And what does it look like? Well, there we go. That's pretty good. Now, the next step in this, once we have that block together, is we want to baste along the outside of the whole block in the area for the seam allowance. So we're just going to turn it over, make sure all of our pieces, especially that one we just sewed, is in place. And we're going to turn our machine to a larger stitch for basting. And we're just going to roughly sew around. And this would work better if you pressed it first. And you should never see those stitches that we just did because they should be in the area that is in the seam. So now what I'm going to do is take my ruler and I'm going to cut this just on the outside. And when I say just on the outside, I mean just, you just can't see that dotted line under my ruler. I'm just going to make all of my edges straight. Cut off all the excess. And that's that portion of the block. So now when I put it together, I think we're done with this. There we go. Now when I put this block together, what we have is this. That's going to be our block. So the next thing is to sew it together. And in her instructions, she does give you some guidance as how to do it. And she's saying to sew A to B, C to D, and then you sew both of those to the center. For these, I'm not sure it makes a huge difference. There's A and this is B. So we're going to sew these together. And the nice thing is, you've got your seam lines, you've got your cut lines. And all we're going to do is we're going to start this right here in the corner. And we're going to put a pin right where the ends of that seam line are. And then we're going to take and do the same thing here. Okay, they're all lined up. That's just great. It works well. It's easy to do. We'll just pin it in the middle. Don't let it shift on you. Okay. And we're just going to sew it. Now remember to go back to your stitching seam length. And we might have to go ahead and pin this one up here too. I don't think we need this one, but we do need this one. We're going to start. And so. And let's see what we have. Okay, it is sewn on the corner, so when we fold it out, We get a nice seam. We've got nice points here. So it looks really good. That's one of the great things about foundation paper piecing is that it's very accurate. I never realized how accurate it was. It just didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me until you get into it. Okay, so we've got that together. Let's do the other side. Well, I'll do that. Let me talk about something else. You're going to find that if you sew all these pieces together with this paper in the middle, it's going to be very difficult to get it apart. So I find that tearing the paper out of the seam allowances once you are happy with that seam makes it just a little bit easier. And what I do is I just fold it to open that up, because that will weaken the paper a little bit. Now you've got these basting stitches, and you're going to have to at least take those out where you want to remove the paper. But that's really very quick to do. And you want to try to leave the other areas in. But we're going to try to take that paper out, if we can get it to cooperate with us here. There we go. I need to take all of those little basting stitches out. All right. Now, I'm going to try to look for some paper that's a little bit lighter weight than this 20-pound paper that I'm using, because I think it's too thick. And I don't know how easily it is to get it. I want to try my local store first, and then if I can't find it there, then move on to some type of ordering or mail order. Okay, I'm just using my ruler as a way to hold the fabric down while I pull that paper out. We're going to do that on both sides. This will need its basting out too. Now, if you wanted just to leave this in, you could. And I think, maybe you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some people, instead of using paper, they use like fabric sheets, fabric softener sheets, and they just leave it in. Perhaps they want that extra stiffness that it gives them. I'm not sure. I think that's an option if you wanted to do that. I don't really know what the long-term effects of that would be. I think it might be great for a wall hanging, but as a quilt, it seems to me it would give you extra bulk and be kind of stiff. But you'll have to make that decision yourself based on what you want it to do. And like I said, perhaps we can get some input from our people watching that have experience with foundation paper piecing. And the smaller the stitches, the easier the paper is going to come out. It's going to, if you get it, the stitch short enough, it's just going to come out like a perforated piece of paper. And I kind of envision that being one of those jobs that is turn on a movie and sit down and do that, maybe piece by piece. I think mine will probably come out before I put the blocks together, but we'll see. Okay, that one I'm going to trim up just a little bit. It's really difficult to get it out. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sew this piece to that piece and do the same on the other side, and I'll be back in just a minute and show you the finished block. We'll just let the camera run. Okay, I'm back and I want to show you what our finished block looks like. I have not pressed this yet, but I was kind of excited to show you what it looks like. And what my steps now will be is to go in and get the rest of this paper off in the back. If I can get everything out of the middle and leave the very outside of the paper, I'll do that, just because we are going to need that outside solid line to sew it to the next block. But here's our block, and I think if you look at it, you can see that it's done a really good job of making sure our points are right where they need to be. It looks like it's very accurate. Remember, you're going to have a seam over here on the outside, so that one looks like it's a little further in, but really it's not going to be. And it's just a really nice looking block. And I think if you recall back to the picture in the book, their Garden of Eden block, the little squares were the lighter color, and then the cross was a darker color. Let's see if I can find this right there. There we go. So here it is here. They've used the darker color. Here's the cross, and the lighter colors for the blocks in this design here and on her actual block. And I've done just the opposite. And I'm going to not necessarily follow the pictures and description in the book, but more or less look at it from a perspective of looking at all of the blocks that we're going to be making. So every time I make one, I'll look at the others we've made before to see, do we need darker colors? Do we need lighter colors? And just what seems to work the best. But there's our first finished block on this quilt here on our program. And I tried to show you what I could show you as far as how I put it together and the things I've already learned. And I know as we go further into this and have more blocks, that there will be many, many more things that will be, we'll find easier ways to do things, ways that make it easier, maybe even just in the process of how you do it, which step you do first, which step you do second, so forth. But I'm real happy with that, and I think as an overall concept for this project, it's going to work out great. So we'll have, I think I said 25 of these blocks put together. The only thing I don't know at this point is how we're going to put it together. Are we just going to sew them block to block, or we're going to put some kind of sashing or setting blocks in between them? We'll decide that as we go along. But there's our first block on our Azure project that is based on the Bible Quilt book. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please take a moment to give us a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you have any input on foundation paper piecing or even this block, the Garden of Eden block, please leave a comment and share that with us. I'm excited to hear from you and anything you might add to our project. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio.